Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good day and a very warm welcome to today's session on the anatomy of duodenum. This is Dr. Mauna Subbaramaya, Associate Professor from Kempegowda Institute of Medical Sciences, Bengaluru. So let's begin the session with an interesting anecdote. There was this 50-year-old female who came with complaints of heartburn and stomach pain since 3 to 4 weeks. The pain increased about, or rather started around 3 to 4 hours after having food, and it was only relieved after taking antacids or by eating something. So what is the first thing that comes to your mind after hearing this case scenario? Yes, it is ulcers. So ulcers can either be present in the stomach or duodenum, and the symptoms here are suggestive of a duodenal ulcer because it was relieved after eating something and the pain occurred about 3 to 4 hours after eating. Did you know that the first part of the duodenum is more prone for ulceration than the rest of the GI tube or the gastrointestinal tract? And if yes, do you know the reason behind it? So that's what we are going to look at in today's session. So we will find the anatomical basis as to why the duodenum or the first part of the duodenum is more prone for ulceration than the rest of the tube. So today's session will be handled under the following headings. First, we will look at the external features, the relations, the internal features, the blood supply, nerve supply, lymphatic drainage, few words about the development, and we will summarize with the clinical anatomy. So moving on to the external features of the duodenum. So here we are going to talk about where is the duodenum exactly located. So duodenum is a retroperitoneal organ which is situated in the epigastric and the umbilical quadrants of the abdomen. So if we were to divide the abdomen into 9 segments by 2 horizontal lines, that is a transpyloric plane and a transtubercular plane, and 2 vertical lines, that is the mid-clavicular lines, the duodenum rests in the epigastric region as well as the umbilical region. So what is the size of the duodenum? Now the word duodenum itself is derived from a Greek word called as dodecadactylos, which was coined by Herophilus, which means the length of the duodenum is equal to the breadth of 12 fingers. So that is about 25 centimeters. So it's a C-shaped organ which is measuring about 25 centimeters, and it is very closely or intimately related to the pancreas. So we can see the intimate relationship between the pancreas and the duodenum in the abdomen. So very often students call them as 2 lovebirds of the abdomen. So what are the different parts of the duodenum? Now the duodenum can be divided into 4 segments. The first part starting from the pyloric sphincter to the superior duodenal flexure. The second part is a vertical part which extends from the superior duodenal flexure to the inferior duodenal flexure. The third part extends from the inferior duodenal flexure to the front of aorta, and the last segment starts from the front of aorta and ends at the duodenojejunal flexure. And this duodenojejunal flexure is held in place by a ligament called as the suspensory ligament of Treitz. So these are the different parts of the duodenum. You can see the first part, which measures about 5 centimeters, the vertical part or the second part, the next horizontal segment, that is the third part, and the fourth small segment, that is the ascending part. We will see each part of the duodenum in detail. So, coming to the first part of the duodenum. So, this is the part which is shown in the dotted structure. So, it extends from the pyloric end of the stomach to the superior duodenal flexure. Its length is about 5 centimeters, and the important features are it is the most movable part of the duodenum. Now, in fact, the proximal part of the duodenum, that is the first initial part, is attached to the lesser omentum. So, that makes this part of the duodenum more mobile compared to the rest of the duodenum, which is retroperitoneal. The next important feature of this part is it is supplied by end arteries. Now, this is a very important feature because the rest of the duodenum is supplied by 2 rows of vasa recta, and only this segment is supplied by end arteries. So, any injury or any damage to these arteries can lead to ischemia and death of this segment. And this is one of the reasons why we have more chances of ulceration in this particular region compared to the rest of the duodenum, because these end arteries, if they are damaged, there is no collateral circulation and there is ischemia. So, this leads to denudation of the duodenal mucosa. The third important feature is this part of the duodenum is devoid of circular muscle folds. The rest of the duodenum has circular mucosal folds, which are called as valves of Kerckring, which go on increasing down the gastrointestinal tube. Only the first part is devoid of this circular muscle folds, and due to this particular reason and due to the activity of the pyloric sphincter, we get a shadow called as the duodenal cap on a burial meal X-ray. So, thus we see that the first part of the duodenum is the most affected region by peptic ulceration, that is because mainly it is supplied by end arteries, and also it is very proximal to the stomach. So, any stomach contents, that is acidic secretions, they are first to reach the first part of duodenum. So, these two major reasons for duodenal ulceration affecting this part more than the rest. And we also saw how the duodenal cap is being formed, that is because of the absence of the circular mucosal folds and the activity of the pyloric sphincter, due to which we get a triangular area beyond the pyloric sphincter seen on barium meal X-rays. So, this was about the first part of the duodenum. So, it extends from the pylorus to the superior duodenal flexure, measures about 5 centimeters. It is supplied by end arteries, it is devoid of circular muscle folds, and it is the most mobile part of the duodenum. So, this was about the first part. Next, let us move on to the second part. So, this is the vertical part of the duodenum. So, here we see the dotted area where it extends. So, it extends from L3 to L1. And it extends from the superior duodenal flexure to the inferior duodenal flexure. So, the superior duodenal flexure is present at L1 and inferior duodenal flexure is present at L3. The total length is about 8 to 10 centimeters, and the entire second part of the duodenum lies medial to the mid-clavicular line, that is the right mid-clavicular line. So, it lies in the right paravertebral gutter. So, what are the important features of this segment? So, this is the most protected part of the duodenum. So, this part of the duodenum is very deeply placed compared to the rest of the duodenum. So, it is protected from external injury. And it also receives the opening of the bile duct and the pancreatic ducts, either through a single opening or 2 openings. So, this is the part which is more prone for bile duct or bile stones formation resulting in obstructive jaundice. This is also a place where there can be presence of congenital anomaly referred to as the annular pancreas, where there is a misguided rotation of the duodenum resulting in the union of the ventral and the dorsal buds surrounding the second part of the duodenum and compressing the duodenal lumen. So, high chances of annular pancreases affect this particular region. So, these are the features of the second part. Moving on to the features of the third part. So, this is the third horizontal part which represents the third part of the duodenum extending from the inferior duodenal flexure to the front of aorta, and it is situated at the level of L3 and it measures anywhere between 8 to 10 centimeters. Now, the important features include it is the most superficial part of the duodenum and vulnerable to external injury. Okay. So, that was about the third part which was present anterior to all the major blood vessels. Coming to the fourth part, this is the last segment measuring about 2.5 centimeters and it extends from L3 to L2, that is from the front of aorta to duodenojejunal flexure. Now, at the region of the duodenojejunal flexure, we have the attachment of the suspensory ligament of Treats or the suspensory ligament of the duodenum. Now, this ligament is made up of either smooth muscles or striated muscles, and one end is attached to the right cross of the diaphragm close to the esophageal opening and the other end is attached to the posterior aspect of the duodenojejunal flexure, and this keeps this flexure in place. So, the length of the segment, this is the shortest segment measuring about 2.5 centimeters, and the important features of this segment is, like I told you, the suspensory ligament which is attached to the duodenojejunal flexure and also the peritoneal recesses which are in relation to this part. There are 4 peritoneal recesses, one from the superior aspect which opens inferiorly, one from the inferior aspect which opens superiorly, one is present at the junction of this third and fourth part, that is called as the retroduodenal recess, and there is one recess which opens to the right and that is called as the paraduodenal recess, and that has the inferior mesenteric vein. So, these are the 4 recesses: superior, inferior, retroduodenal and paraduodenal recess related to the fourth part of the duodenum. So, this was about the external features of the 4 parts of the duodenum. Next, moving on to the important relations. So, what I have done for the relations is, instead of dividing it into first, second, third and fourth part and then talking about the superior, inferior, anterior, posterior relations, what I have done is in a simpler way, all the anterior relations of the duodenum, all the posterior relations of the duodenum, all the structures which are related to the convex surface of the duodenum and to the concave surface. So, that gives you an overview of all the structures which are related intimately to the duodenum. So, let us look at the anterior relations. So, to the first part we have the liver and also the fundus and the body of the gallbladder. So, these 2 structures are related to the first part of the duodenum, and as you come down for the second part we have the transverse colon being related, and as we come further down the coils of jejunum come into picture which are related to the second and the third part, and also the third part is related to the superior mesenteric vessels. So, these are the structures which are related anteriorly to the duodenum. So, to repeat, we have the liver, gallbladder, the transverse colon, the small intestinal coils and the superior mesenteric vessels. So, all these structures are related to the anterior aspect of the duodenum. Moving on to the posterior aspect of the duodenum. So, to the first part we have the gastroduodenal artery, which is related here on the posterior aspect of the first part. Then we have the portal vein, the inferior vena cava and the bile duct. So, all these 4 structures are related to the posterior aspect of the first part of the duodenum. So, to repeat, it is the gastroduodenal artery, the portal vein, the inferior vena cava and the bile duct. And also the superior aspect of this first part gives attachment to the lesser omentum, and along the free margin of the lesser omentum all these structures like the bile duct, the portal vein and the hepatic artery. So, all these are intimately related to this first part of the duodenum. The second part is related to a part of the suprarenal gland, the right kidney, the inferior vena cava, the right ureter and the right psoas. So, these are the 5 structures which are related to the posterior aspect of the second part of the duodenum. So, to repeat, we have the suprarenal gland, the right kidney, the inferior vena cava, the right ureter and the right psoas major. So, next coming to the third part, these are the structures. So, again we start from the inferior vena cava. So, you can see the relation of the inferior vena cava to the third part here. Then we have again the part of the right ureter being related to the third part. We have the right psoas also being related to the third part. Then we have the right gonadal vessels and we have the abdominal aorta also being related to the third part. And if we come across, we find the left sympathetic chain and we move on to the left segments. So, to the third part, these are the structures which are related. So, to mention a few, that is the inferior vena cava, the right ureter, the right psoas, the right gonadal vessels, the abdominal aorta and partly the left sympathetic chain. And to the last segment, that is the fourth part, we have the following structures, again starting from the abdominal aorta, the left sympathetic chain, the left psoas, the left gonadal vessels, the inferior mesenteric veins and the left renal veins. So, here we see that a few of the structures are related to more than one segments of the duodenum. For example, inferior vena cava, the right ureter, the right psoas. So, the relations keep on repeating. So, that is the idea why I chose to summarize all the relations on the posterior aspect in one particular slide. So, to repeat the relations, we start from the gastroduodenal artery, portal vein, inferior vena cava and bile duct to the first part, suprarenal gland, the right kidney, inferior vena cava, the right ureter, the right psoas to the second part, then inferior vena cava, right ureter, right psoas, the right gonadal, abdominal aorta and the left sympathetic chain to the third part, and the abdominal aorta, the left sympathetic chain, the left psoas, the left gonadal vessels and inferior mesenteric vein along with the left renal vessels to the fourth part. So, that was a huge summary of relations on the posterior aspect. So, next let us move on to the convex surface relations. So, this is a little bit easier slide. So, the first part, like I mentioned before, it is the first part gives attachment to the lesser omentum, that is the proximal part of the first segment of duodenum, and along with this you find the portal vein, the bile duct and the hepatic artery, and just behind this attachment of the lesser omentum we have the floor of the epiploic foramen being related to the first part of duodenum. Coming to the outer aspects of the rest of the duodenum, these are the structures which are involved. So, you have the hepatic artery which is related to the first part, then we have the transverse colon, then we have the coils of jejunum, and we have the inferior mesenteric vein. So, that was about the convex surface, and moving on to the concave surface, we have the pancreas and the opening of the bile duct into the second part of the duodenum, and the third part is related to the superior mesenteric vessels. So, the relations to the convex and the concave surfaces, if you have to summarize, the pancreas is located within the C-shaped part of the duodenum like this. So, the head and neck of the pancreas is intimately related to the first, second and third part of the duodenum, and the superior mesenteric vessel is related to the third part again, and the bile duct opens into the second part of the duodenum either along with the pancreatic duct or they open through two separate channels. So, this was in short about the relations of the duodenum starting from its anterior surface, posterior surface, convex surface and concave surface. So, next we will move on to the internal features of the duodenum. So, again here when we talk about the internal features, we will first talk about the wall structure of the duodenum. So, this will be dealt in detail in the histological sessions. I will just outlay the different layers which the duodenal wall is made up of. So, these include the serosa, the muscular coat which involves the outer longitudinal and inner circular muscle coat, and in between these two we find the myenteric or the Auerbach's nerve plexus. Inner to that we find the submucosa, and submucosa in the duodenum is very unique because it has the glands. Like the esophagus, we find submucosal glands in the duodenum as well, and here they are referred to as the Brunner's glands. And the reason why we have these glands is to neutralize the secretions which are being poured into by the bile duct. And the inner mucous membrane has many features. So, there are mucosal folds which can be temporary and they disappear on distension, and there are also certain permanent folds, circular folds which start from the second segment of the duodenum and proceed distally. And we also find crypts, the crypts of Lebekoon which are associated with the mucosal glands. We have the presence of villi and microvilli. So, all these in fact they increase the surface area of the duodenal mucosae. Since the primary function of the duodenum is absorption, we have an increased surface area by modifications of all these features. So, coming to the individual segments, these are the specifications which are related to the internal features. So, the first part is devoid of circular folds. So, we have already seen this. We have already mentioned it in the when we were describing the external features of the duodenum. So, the first part of the duodenum is devoid of circular muscle folds, whereas the other parts they have these mucosal folds and they are referred to as valves of Kerckring. The unique feature of the second part is the opening of the major duodenal papillae. So, that is present about 8 to 10 centimeters distal to the pyloric end. So, this is the pyloric end. So, it is about 8 to 10 centimeters distal to it. and like I said before, this presents either a single opening or two separate openings of the bile duct and the pancreatic duct, and at the region of the opening we have a sphincter referred to as a sphincter of Oddi. Again, this is a collection of the sphincters of the individual ducts, that is the pancreatic duct, the bile duct, and a common terminal sphincter. So, that is about the major duodenal papillae, and just above this major duodenal papillae is an elevation referred to as the plica semicircularis, which resembles a monk's hood. And there is also a longitudinal muscle bundle which runs from the distal end of the major duodenal papillae, and this represents the intraduodenal part of the bile duct. So, there is another opening which is present, that is the minor duodenal papillae, which is present about 2 centimeters anterior and ventral to the major duodenal papillae, and this need not always be present. If it is usually present when there is an accessory pancreatic duct which opens separately. So, it may or may not be seen. So, if it is present 2 centimeters proximal and a little ventral to the major papillae. So, this was about the features of the duodenum which we find on the interior aspect. So, the first part is devoid of the circular folds, the second part has the openings of the major duodenal, can have the opening of a minor duodenal papillae, and the other minor features like the plica semicircularis and the plica longitudinalis. So, with this we will move on to the clinical anatomy. So, that is the sphincter of Oddi, which is nothing but a combination of the sphincters of the pancreatic duct as well as the bile duct and the terminal portion of the opening of both those ducts. So, since we have this sphincter of Oddi, there are high chances of bile stone impaction in the second part of the duodenum, and wherever there is obstruction, it can result in obstructive jaundice. So, this is the clinical anatomy with respect to the internal features modifications. Next, moving on to the blood supply of the duodenum. So, different parts of the duodenum are supplied by different types of arteries. The first segment is supplied by end arteries. So, this again we have already studied that the first segment of the duodenum is supplied by end arteries, which if damaged can lead to ischemia. But the rest of the duodenum is supplied by vasa recta. So, these are nothing but 2 rows of branches which are supplying the remaining segment of the duodenum. So, there are less chances of ischemia in this segment. So, the first part, the main arteries which are supplying are the supraduodenal branch of the duodenum, or commonly referred to as the artery of Wilkie. So, this is a branch from the gastroduodenal artery which supplies the upper 2/3 of the anterior surface and upper 1/3 of the posterior surface of the first part of duodenum. Sometimes we have an additional branch called as the retroduodenal branch, again from the gastroduodenal artery, which can supply the posterior aspect of the duodenum. Now, the inferior aspect of the duodenum is usually supplied by the infraduodenal branch, which is a branch coming from the right gastroepiploic artery. So, all these 3 arteries which are supplying the first part are end arteries. So, any constriction will lead to ischemia, which can lead to denudation of the mucosa, which results in ulceration. So, the next segment, that is beyond the first part, all these arteries are nothing but the ventral and the dorsal anastomosis between the superior and inferior pancreatico-duodenal arteries. Okay. So, there are 2 rows of arteries which are supplying. So, even if one artery is kinked, the other takes over and there is ample amount of collateral circulation. So, the chances of ischemia in this segment is less. Okay. So, and also we see that the superior pancreatico-duodenal is coming from the celiac trunk and the inferior pancreatico-duodenal will be coming from the superior mesenteric artery, and this division is on the basis of the development of the duodenum. The higher segment is from the foregut and the lower segment is from the midgut, which we will see in the subsequent slides. Okay. And the venous drainage is into the superior mesenteric vein and into the trunk of the portal vein. So, this was in brief about the blood supply of the duodenum. So, thus by knowing the blood supply and by knowing the proximity of the first part of the duodenum to the stomach, we see why the first part of the duodenum is more prone for ulceration. So, this is a picture which shows ulcer in the first part of the duodenum. Coming to the nerve supply, duodenum, like the rest of the GIT, is supplied by sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. The sympathetic is usually from T6 to T9 segments and they reach the celiac plexus and the superior mesenteric plexus, and they are stimulant to the sphincteric action and to the muscularis mucosae, and they reduce the peristalsis, whereas the parasympathetic nerves, they are usually from the vagus and they reach the Auerbach's and the Meissner's plexus, and their effects are opposite to that of the sympathetic nerves. A few words about the lymphatic drainage. It is nothing but the pancreatico-duodenal group of lymph nodes which ultimately drain into the celiac and superior mesenteric group of lymph nodes. So, a few words about the development. I will just overlay a few general aspects, because again the development of duodenum will be dealt in detail in the subsequent embryology sessions. So, the duodenum is divided into two parts, the part above the bile duct opening which develops from the foregut, and the part below the bile duct opening which develops from the midgut, and this we can see in the way the blood supply is distributed. So, the foregut is supplied by the branches of celiac artery and the midgut is supplied by branches of the superior mesenteric artery. So, if we take the development of duodenum as such, it develops in three stages. One is rotation, fixation and axial rotation. So, in case of rotation, initially the duodenum is as a ventral loop. So, it is situated like this, it is in a ventral loop. Then it undergoes rotation to the right, so that the anterior surface now becomes the right surface. So, this rotation is associated with the rotation of the stomach, and once it gets rotated, it gets fixed. That is, the posterior aspect of the peritoneal lining undergoes zygosis and it is degenerated, and the posterior aspect becomes fixed to the posterior underlying structure. So, it becomes a retroperitoneal organ, and in the third stage there is axial rotation, that is adjacent. As the duodenum is being developed, the pancreas is also being developed as a dorsal bud and a ventral bud. So, these two have to join to form one single mass. So, this is formed by the axial rotation of the duodenum, and during this stage it undergoes obliteration and then recanalization. So, if at any stage any of the stages are incomplete, they can lead to congenital anomalies. And also we see that during the rotation, the peritoneal lining is also getting rotated, and they result in the formation of these recesses, that is the superior recess, the inferior recess, the retroduodenal recess and the paraduodenal recess. So, these are the usual congenital anomalies in relation to development. So, there can be duodenal atresia, So, like I said, while during axial rotation, if there is non-recanalization after obliteration, then it can lead to duodenal atresia. There can be annular pancreas. So, instead of the ventral bud and the dorsal bud uniting, they surround the second part of the duodenum like a circle, and they form an annular pancreas and constrict the duodenum. So, this is annular pancreas. There are also presence of duodenal diverticulae. So, this typically happens along the second part of the duodenum along the concave border. So, there are more chances of outgrowths or extra diverticulae along this part of the duodenum. And these duodenal recesses which we mentioned, that is the superior, inferior, para and retroduodenal recesses, they are sites for herniation. So, any internal structure can herniate into these and result in strangulation. So, one has to be really careful while when we have these peritoneal recesses. And special mention about this inferior mesenteric vein, which is in relation to the paraduodenal recess. So, in today's session, we studied about the different external features of the duodenum. So, the duodenum is a retroperitoneal part of the gastrointestinal tube measuring about 25 centimeters. This is quite narrow as compared to the rest of the GIT. And the important relations which we saw, that is the posterior relations, the anterior relations, the opening of the bile duct into the second part of the duodenum, and the important relations to the convex surface. We also saw about the internal features, the blood supply, that is typically the first part of the duodenum is supplied by end arteries, whereas the rest of the duodenum is supplied by vasa recta, that is 2 rows. Then a few words about the nerve supply, lymphatic drainage, and we also saw how the duodenum develops in 2 parts, that's foregut and midgut, through 3 stages, that is rotation, fixation and axial rotation. And we summarized many clinical aspects. So, with that, we come to the end of today's session, and I am once again very thankful to the entire NPTEL Swayamprabha team and the coordinator Dr. Vijay Sagar sir, and a special mention to my gastroenterologist friend who provided me with the endoscopic pictures. So, never stop learning, because life never stops teaching. So, with that, I end today's session. Good day. Thank you.